Years passed, and Eric's ranch flourished beneath the protective embrace of his forest. What had started as an act of defiance grew into something far more meaningful, a sanctuary for wildlife, a shield against erosion, and a buffer that kept the chaos of the HOA at bay. The trees towered high, their dense canopy filtering sunlight in dappled patterns across the ground. Birds nested in their branches, squirrels scampered through their trunks, and deer wandered along the edges, drawn by the abundance of food and shelter. For Eric, the forest wasn't just a barrier. It was a living testament to what could be achieved with patience, determination, and respect for nature. Life on the ranch returned to its peaceful rhythm. Eric spent his days tending to his cattle, planting crops, and caring for his chickens. The roosters still crowed at dawn, but now their calls blended harmoniously with the rustling leaves and chirping birds. Wildflowers bloomed where sunlight filtered through the trees, creating pockets of color that brightened even the darkest corners of his land. His once threatened fields thrived under the partial shade, producing healthier crops than ever before. The forest had given him back something the HOA had tried to take away: balance. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Meanwhile, the gated community continued its slow decline. Empty houses lined the streets, their lawns overgrown and pools filled with stagnant water. Those who remained struggled to maintain appearances, but the neighborhood no longer carried the air of luxury it once did. Real estate agents avoided mentioning the area altogether, except to warn clients about the tree problem. Visitors driving by couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Eric's vibrant ranch and the gloomy subdivision next door. Some whispered stories of a stubborn rancher who outsmarted an arrogant HOA, while others saw it as a cautionary tale about greed and hubris. Either way, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, revenge is best served naturally. Despite everything, not all of Eric's neighbors harbored resentment. A few came to admire his quiet strength and ingenuity. One elderly couple, whose home sat furthest from the forest, often stopped by to chat. They brought homemade pies or jars of jam, thanking him for standing up to the HOA when no one else dared. "You showed them they can't push everyone around," the woman said during one visit, her voice warm with gratitude. Eric smiled, appreciating the gesture but remaining humble. To him, this wasn't about being a hero. It was about protecting what mattered most. As time went on, Eric found himself reflecting less on the conflict and more on the lessons it had taught him. He realized that anger alone wouldn't have been enough to sustain him through those difficult years. It was his love for the land, his connection to nature, and his belief in doing what was right that kept him going. The forest had become a symbol of resilience, proof that even the smallest actions could grow into something powerful if nurtured with care. And though he never sought recognition, he took pride in knowing that his story inspired others to stand firm in the face of injustice. On quiet evenings, Eric would sit on his porch, gazing at the towering trees that stretched toward the horizon. He thought about how far he'd come, from the day the HOA laughed at him to the moment they realized they couldn't break him. The wall they'd built still stood, a reminder of their arrogance, but it no longer cast a shadow over his life, literally or figuratively. Instead, it marked the beginning of a journey that transformed both him and the land he called home. In the end, Eric proved that the best victories aren't loud or flashy. They're rooted in growth, patience, and the quiet power of nature. His forest didn't just block sunlight. It restored balance, healed wounds, and reminded everyone who crossed its path that true strength lies in standing your ground and letting the world adapt to you. That night, Eric sat alone on his porch, nursing a glass of whiskey as the weight of the HOA's mockery settled over him. The laughter echoed in his mind, louder than the crickets chirping in the distance. He replayed their smug faces and dismissive comments, each one fueling the fire of resentment burning inside him. For hours, he stared out at the retaining wall that now loomed over his property like an unwelcome intruder. It wasn't just blocking his view. It symbolized everything he had lost: peace, freedom, and respect. But as much as it hurt, Eric refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he decided to channel his anger into something productive, something that would make the HOA regret ever crossing him. As dawn broke, Eric found himself scrolling through articles online, searching for ways to reclaim control of his situation. That's when he stumbled upon a story about how trees could be used strategically to block sunlight and obstruct views. At first, the idea seemed far-fetched, but the more he read, the more intrigued he became. Trees were natural, legal, and impossible to argue against. They weren't fences or walls. They were living things that belonged on any property. And if planted correctly, they could grow tall enough to cast shadows across the HOA's precious community. A slow smile spread across Eric's face as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice, served quietly and patiently. Over the next few days, Eric threw himself into research. He studied different tree species, focusing on those that grew quickly, thrived in his region, and formed dense canopies. Poplars, willows, and eucalyptus topped his list. He visited local nurseries, buying saplings by the hundreds and negotiating bulk discounts whenever possible. Every penny he had saved went into this project. Friends and family thought he'd gone mad when he explained his plan. But Eric didn't care. To him, this was more than planting trees. It was reclaiming his dignity. Each morning, Eric woke before sunrise, grabbing his tools and heading out to the edge of his property. He marked rows with stakes and string, carefully spacing the saplings to ensure maximum coverage. Digging holes, planting roots, and watering each tiny tree became his routine. His hands blistered, his back ached, and sweat soaked through his shirt, but he didn't stop. Neighbors from the gated community watched curiously at first, some even asking what he was doing. Just adding a little greenery, he'd reply with a grin, leaving them none the wiser. As the weeks turned into months, the rows of trees began to take shape. What started as fragile saplings soon grew into sturdy young plants, stretching toward the sky. Word spread among the HOA members, who initially dismissed Eric's efforts as harmless eccentricity. He's just trying to pretty up his land, one resident joked during a meeting. Others nodded in agreement, confident that Eric's trees posed no real threat. They couldn't have been more wrong. What they failed to realize was that Eric wasn't planting these trees for aesthetics. He was building a fortress of nature. Each trunk represented a step toward reclaiming his power, each leaf a reminder that he wouldn't back down. The HOA had laughed at him, underestimated him, and assumed he was powerless. Now, Eric was proving them wrong, one tree at a time. As he worked, he imagined the day when their manicured lawns would sit in shadow, their sparkling pools would chill under gloomy skies, and their perfect lives would feel the sting of poetic justice. It might take years for the trees to reach their full height, but Eric was willing to wait. After all, revenge is sweetest when it grows slowly. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal summer. The HOA's once proud community, now shrouded in near-permanent shade, descended into chaos. Homeowners who had invested their life savings into dream properties found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Real estate agents avoided the neighborhood altogether, warning potential buyers about the dark side of the development. Those desperate enough to list their homes often slashed prices repeatedly, only to have them sit on the market for months, or worse, years. The HOA meetings, once filled with cheerful updates about community events and landscaping projects, turned into heated arguments. Fingers were pointed, tempers flared, and accusations flew like arrows. But no one could agree on a solution. Karen, the HOA president, grew increasingly frantic. Her leadership was crumbling along with the neighborhood's property values. She called emergency sessions almost weekly, hoping to rally the residents into action. Some suggested petitioning the local government to intervene, while others proposed suing Eric again. Despite multiple failed attempts, a few even floated the idea of cutting down the trees themselves, legality be damned. But every plan ended in dead ends. Eric's forest was untouchable, protected by both law and his meticulous preparation. Each failure pushed Karen closer to her limits until she finally decided to confront Eric one last time. She arrived at his ranch on a humid afternoon, her car kicking up dust as she parked near the edge of the towering forest. Eric was outside, inspecting the base of one of his trees, when he saw her approaching. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow, and waited silently as she walked toward him. For once, Karen wasn't armed with demands or threats. Instead, her shoulders sagged under the weight of defeat, and her eyes glistened with unused tears. "Eric," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm begging you. Please, just trim some of these trees, or take half of them down. Anything. Our community is falling apart because of this. Families are leaving, businesses are pulling out, and we can't recover unless something changes." Eric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He remembered the laughter at that fateful meeting years ago, the mocking tone, the dismissive comments, the way they treated him like an inconvenience to be swept aside. Now here was Karen, humbled and broken, asking for mercy. Part of him felt a flicker of satisfaction, knowing they were finally experiencing the same helplessness he'd endured. But another part of him, buried deep beneath layers of anger and frustration, wondered if there was still room for reconciliation. After a pause, Eric spoke. "You laughed at me when I told you how much my view meant to me. You didn't care then, so why should I care now?" His voice was calm but firm, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "This isn't just about revenge, Karen. It's about respect. You took mine away, and now you know what it feels like to lose something you value." Karen opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, realizing there was no response that could undo the damage. She nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks, and turned to leave. As she drove away, Eric watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions. Satisfaction. Yes. Justice served. Absolutely. But also a faint sadness, a recognition that things could have been different if pride hadn't gotten in the way. In the weeks that followed, the HOA made one final attempt to salvage their community. They hired consultants to redesign parts of the neighborhood, focusing on indoor amenities since outdoor spaces were unusable. Artificial lighting was installed in common areas, and gardens were replaced with shade-tolerant plants. But none of it mattered. The charm of the place was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of gloom. Residents moved out in droves, leaving behind empty houses and overgrown lawns. The gated community, once a symbol of luxury, became a cautionary tale whispered among real estate circles. For Eric, however, life went on much as it always had. He continued tending to his ranch and his forest, finding solace in the rhythm of nature. The laughter of the HOA members no longer echoed in his mind. Instead, he heard the rustling of leaves and the songs of birds nesting in his trees. What started as an act of defiance had grown into something greater, a reminder that resilience, patience, and determination could overcome even the most daunting challenges. And though the shadow of conflict lingered, Eric knew he had stood his ground and won. By the fourth year, Eric's forest had grown into an impenetrable barrier, casting long, unyielding shadows across the HOA's prized community. What was once a sunny haven of manicured lawns and sparkling amenities now felt like a dim, unwelcoming place. The transformation was undeniable and devastating. Residents who had paid top dollar for their dream homes found themselves trapped in a perpetual twilight, unable to enjoy the outdoor lifestyles they had envisioned. Swimming pools that were meant to shimmer under the sun sat cold and unused, their surfaces dull and lifeless beneath the thick canopy above. Solar panels, touted as eco-friendly investments, barely generated enough power to keep garden lights on. Even the lush green lawns, meticulously maintained by homeowners, began to yellow and wither without adequate sunlight. The HOA board scrambled to address the growing crisis, but every solution they proposed only highlighted their desperation. They suggested installing artificial lighting in backyards to mimic daylight, but the cost was astronomical, and it still couldn't replicate the warmth of real sunlight. Some residents tried trimming the lower branches of Eric's trees that hung over the fence line, hoping to let in more light. But Eric, ever vigilant, quickly filed a complaint citing property damage, forcing them to stop. Others attempted to sabotage the trees by sneaking onto his land at night, armed with saws and axes. Security cameras caught them red-handed, and Eric turned the footage over to local authorities, leading to fines and public embarrassment for those involved. As tensions escalated, the HOA resorted to increasingly drastic measures. They organized petitions demanding Eric remove or trim the trees, claiming they posed a safety hazard during storms. When that failed, they offered him money. First thousands, then tens of thousands, to cut down even half of the forest. Eric politely declined each offer, knowing full well that their desperation was a sign of his success. At one point, the HOA president, Karen, personally visited Eric's ranch, her usual air of superiority replaced by quiet desperation. Sitting across from him at his kitchen table, she pleaded with tears in her eyes. "Eric, please," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just about us. It's affecting property values. People are leaving because they can't sell their homes. We'll do anything to make this right." Eric leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before responding. "You had your chance," he said evenly. "You ruined my view, mocked me, and acted like I didn't matter. Now you know how it feels to lose something you value." Karen left empty-handed, and the HOA was forced to admit defeat. Their attempts to control Eric had backfired spectacularly, leaving them powerless to undo the changes he had wrought. Meanwhile, Eric continued tending to his forest, watching with quiet satisfaction as nature reclaimed what had been taken from him. The trees weren't just blocking sunlight. They were symbols of resilience, proof that even the smallest acts of defiance could grow into something unstoppable. For the HOA members, life became a constant reminder of their hubris. Every time they stepped outside, they were greeted by the towering trunks and rustling leaves of Eric's creation. Children whispered about the angry man with the dark forest, while adults muttered bitterly about missed opportunities and wasted investments. The neighborhood that had once been a symbol of luxury and exclusivity now carried an air of gloom, its perfection marred by the shadow of Eric's revenge. Yet, despite their suffering, no one dared cross Eric again. His calm determination and unwavering resolve had earned him a reputation as someone not to be trifled with. And as the days grew shorter and the shadows longer, the HOA came to realize the truth. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't anger or aggression. It's patience, persistence, and the quiet strength of nature itself. The clash between Eric and the Homeowners Association, HOA, quickly escalated from minor disagreements to full-blown conflict. What started as polite requests soon turned into demands, each more unreasonable than the last. The HOA wanted Eric's ranch to conform to their vision of perfection, a vision that had no room for wildflower meadows, weathered fences, or crowing roosters. To them, Eric's way of life was messy, outdated, and incompatible with the polished image they were trying to project. But Eric wasn't about to let go of the things that made his home special without a fight. When the HOA demanded he replace his wooden fence with something modern, Eric refused outright. That fence wasn't just a boundary. It was part of his ranch's history. It had stood through storms, watched over countless sunrises, and held stories of hard work and resilience. Replacing it felt like erasing a piece of himself. Then came the complaints about his wildflower meadow. To Eric, it was a vibrant tapestry of colors, buzzing with bees and fluttering with butterflies. To the HOA, however, it was an eyesore, a chaotic patch of weeds that disrupted the pristine look of their manicured lawns. They sent letter after letter, insisting he mow it down and plant grass instead. But Eric knew better. Wildflowers weren't just beautiful. They supported local wildlife and helped maintain the natural balance of the land. The final straw came when the HOA complained about the noise from Eric's roosters. Every morning at dawn, the birds would announce the start of a new day with their loud crows. For Eric, This was one of the joys of living on a ranch. The sound reminded him of simpler times, connecting him to nature in a way nothing else could. But the HOA saw it differently. Their residents, accustomed to quiet suburban mornings, filed noise complaints in droves. One member even called the roosters a public nuisance. Eric couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could anyone find fault with something so natural? Frustrated but determined, Eric attended an HOA meeting to voice his concerns. He explained how his ranch operated sustainably, how every element played a role in maintaining harmony with the environment. He pleaded with them to understand his perspective, hoping they might see the value in coexistence. Instead, they laughed. Not subtle chuckles or smirks, full-blown laughter. One board member quipped, "You're fighting a losing battle. Eric, we run this place now." Another added, "Your little farm is cute, but it doesn't belong here anymore." The message was clear. Eric's way of life didn't fit into their plans, and there was nothing he could do about it. What hurt most wasn't just the words, it was the tone. The condescension, the mockery, the sheer disregard for everything Eric held dear. As he sat there, surrounded by people who viewed him as an inconvenience, anger began to simmer inside him. He left the meeting feeling powerless yet resolved. If they thought they could push him around, they were wrong. Eric had spent years building his dream, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him, not without a fight. But how does one stand up to an organization with deep pockets and strict rules? Eric didn't have the resources to challenge them legally, nor did he want to stoop to their level of pettiness. Yet, as he drove back to his ranch that evening, an idea began to form. It was bold, unconventional, and maybe even a little mischievous. But it was within his rights. Eric smiled to himself, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. The HOA had underestimated him, and that was their first mistake. They thought they had all the power, but Eric was about to show them that sometimes the best revenge grows slowly and quietly. As the months rolled by, Eric's army of trees began to transform the landscape. What had once been an open border between his ranch and the HOA's gated community was now a dense wall of greenery. The young saplings grew faster than anyone expected, their branches reaching skyward as if determined to reclaim the sunlight stolen by the retaining wall. Eric worked tirelessly, tending to each tree with care, watering them during dry spells, pruning stray branches, and ensuring they had everything they needed to thrive. To him, these trees weren't just plants. They were soldiers in a quiet war, standing guard against the arrogance of the HOA. At first, the neighbors didn't pay much attention. Some even complimented Eric on his landscaping project, assuming he was simply beautifying his property. A few residents joked about how ironic it was that the man who resisted modernization was now creating what looked like a mini forest. But as the rows of trees thickened and stretched further along the boundary, curiosity turned to unease. People started noticing how the afternoon sun no longer reached certain parts of their yards. Shadows crept earlier and lingered longer, swallowing up pools of light that used to dance across manicured lawns. Still, most dismissed it as a temporary issue. After all, trees take years to mature, right? Surely this wouldn't become a real problem anytime soon. But Eric knew better. He had chosen fast-growing species for a reason, and the results were already visible. By the end of the second year, the tallest trees stood over 30 feet high, forming a canopy that blocked not only the view, but also significant amounts of sunlight. Backyards that were once bathed in golden afternoon rays now felt dim and chilly. Expensive gardens wilted under the sudden lack of warmth, and solar panels installed on rooftops barely generated enough energy to justify their cost. Even the sparkling swimming pools, once the pride of the community, sat unused as the water remained cold and uninviting. The HOA board couldn't ignore the growing complaints from residents. At first, they tried to downplay the issue, telling concerned homeowners that the trees would thin out as they matured or suggesting they install additional lighting to compensate for the loss of sunlight. But when the shadows deepened and property values began to dip, panic set in. Desperate, the HOA sent representatives to speak with Eric, hoping to negotiate a solution. "Eric, we need to talk," said one board member during a tense visit. "These trees are causing problems for our community. Can't we come to some kind of agreement?" Eric listened calmly, leaning against his shovel with a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm sorry," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "These trees are on my property, and I have every right to plant them. If you're having issues, maybe you should have thought about that before building your wall." Frustrated but unable to argue, the HOA resorted to legal threats, claiming Eric's trees constituted a nuisance. They filed paperwork, hired lawyers, and even held emergency meetings to discuss potential solutions. But no matter what they did, Eric stayed one step ahead. He had done his homework, ensuring every aspect of his project complied with local laws. Judges repeatedly sided with him, ruling that he was well within his rights as a landowner. Each defeat only fueled the HOA's frustration, while Eric savored the irony. They had laughed at him, mocked him, and tried to bully him into submission. Now they were powerless to stop him. As the third year approached, the forest showed no signs of slowing down. Birds nested in its branches, squirrels darted through its foliage, and wildflowers sprouted at its base. For Eric, it was more than revenge. It was a testament to nature's resilience. The HOA had underestimated both him and the power of the natural world. And as the shadows lengthened across their perfect neighborhood, they finally understood the depth of their mistake. Eric Thompson had always dreamed of a simple, peaceful life. Growing up in the city, he often found himself staring out of his apartment window, imagining what it would be like to live surrounded by open land, fresh air, and endless skies. After years of hard work, saving every bonus, cutting unnecessary expenses, and even taking on side jobs, he finally saved enough to buy his dream ranch. Nestled in a quiet valley, the property was everything he had ever wanted. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. The mornings were magical. Eric would sit on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in his life, he felt truly happy. The ranch wasn't just a home, it was a lifestyle. Eric spent his days tending to his small herd of cattle, planting vegetables in his garden, and caring for his chickens. He loved the way the roosters greeted the dawn with their loud crows, a sound he found comforting rather than annoying. His wooden fence might have been weathered, but it had character. It told the story of years gone by, standing strong against wind and rain. Even the wildflower meadow, though untamed, was something Eric cherished. It attracted bees, butterflies, and birds, creating a symphony of natural sounds that filled the air. Life was perfect, or so he thought. Things began to change when developers purchased the neighboring land. At first, Eric didn't mind. He assumed they would build a few houses, maybe a farm or two, and everyone would live peacefully side by side. But soon, bulldozers rolled in, tearing up the tranquil landscape. In its place rose an upscale gated community, complete with manicured lawns, sparkling fountains, and shiny new homes. The development was governed by a strict homeowners association, HOA, a group of people who took pride in maintaining what they called elegant living. At first, the HOA seemed harmless enough. They sent polite letters introducing themselves and inviting Eric to community events. But it didn't take long for their true intentions to surface. One day, Eric received a notice demanding he replace his old wooden fence with a modern one that matched the aesthetic of their neighborhood. Another letter followed, complaining about his wildflower meadow, which they described as messy and unattractive. Then came the noise complaints about his roosters waking up too early. Each request chipped away at Eric's freedom, turning his once idyllic life into a series of battles. Eric tried to reason with them, explaining that this was his land, his home, and he had no intention of changing it to suit their preferences. But the HOA wasn't interested in compromise. Instead, they doubled down, approving plans to construct a massive retaining wall along their shared boundary. When the wall went up, it not only blocked Eric's stunning view, but also cast long shadows across his fields, disrupting the delicate balance of light and shade his crops depended on. Livestock struggled to graze in the dimness, and plants that thrived in sunlight began to wilt. Eric's heart sank as he realized his dream was slipping away. What hurt most, however, was the laughter. During a particularly heated meeting, several HOA members openly mocked Eric's protests. "What can you do?" One of them sneered. "You're just one man against all of us." Their dismissive attitude stung more than the wall itself. Eric left the meeting feeling defeated, but not broken. Little did they know, their arrogance had planted the seed of an idea in Eric's mind. If they thought he was powerless, they were about to learn otherwise. And when Eric set his mind to something, he didn't give up easily.